Hi again, welcome back to our final video on the Cambrian Explosion. So we'll wrap up this subject by considering some of the factors that might have set the stage for, or caused, or contributed in some way to this event. So the Cambrian Explosion was a diversification of animals over 30 or 40 million years or so during the Cambrian period, but with an earlier history of animal evolution going back tens or potentially more than 100 million years back into the Proterozoic. So the Cambrian Explosion is marked by the diversification of large animals, such as the arthropods from the previous video that you heard about, but also by the diversification of things called small shelly fossils, which are a variety of animals, just named because they're small and they're shells, and by an increase in the types of trace fossils, or burrows and trackways and so forth, including the first burrows that dug into the seafloor, the first vertical burrows. So what kinds of things have been proposed as potential causes of the Cambrian Explosion? Some of these factors might have been background factors or preconditions that set the stage, while others might have been the immediate triggers that led to the diversification itself. And these factors can be grouped, I would say, into two main categories: environmental ones and biological ones. And these environmental factors might include increased oxygen levels or changing ocean chemistry, such as an increase in calcium in the oceans. And the biological factors might include genetic innovations that enabled more complex body structures, or potentially feedback processes where ecological interactions opened up more opportunities for diversification. So let's explore these different factors. Well, you've learned that oxygen first increased during the Great Oxidation event about 2.4 billion years ago, but that didn't bring it to modern levels, actually. And sort of in a secondary thing, we need to consider oxygen levels in the ocean, which is where animals evolved. And although oxygen is the same everywhere in the atmosphere at sea level, it varies a lot in the ocean, both by depth and spatially in different parts of the ocean and different parts of the world. So given that, we need to see if there's enough oxygen in the right places in the ocean, and if there's enough places in the ocean for animals to live for them to be able to evolve. So evidence from uranium in sedimentary rocks suggests that oxygen-rich waters did become more widespread during the Cambrian. So how does this work? Well, let's take a very general ocean with a lot of anoxia, which is water without oxygen, and a small amount of oxygen-rich waters near the surface. So uranium enters the ocean from rivers and is mostly removed from the ocean in muddy sediments, especially in areas where the water is anoxic. So if a lot of the ocean floor is anoxic, then a lot of uranium is removed, and the balance between the input and the output tends to leave only a small amount of uranium in the ocean. However, in an ocean where less of the seafloor is anoxic, that means that less uranium is removed in these muddy sediments. And therefore, the balance between the input and the smaller output tends to lead to more uranium in the ocean. So as a result, rocks that form directly from seawater, such as limestone rocks, will record those higher uranium amounts. And if we look at the record, uranium levels were very low prior to the Cambrian period, but increased considerably during the Cambrian period itself, especially during the early and middle parts of it. And while there are some animals that can live at very low oxygen levels, higher oxygen is important for the evolution of large animals, and animals with high levels of movement, and also for carnivorous animals. So there's also evidence that oxygen-rich habitat area increased during the Cambrian. Now the shallowest part of the ocean, will always have some oxygen in it because it's in connection with the atmosphere. However, in South China, at least where this data comes from, the outer parts of the continental shelf during the early Cambrian continued to have low oxygen conditions for some time, and they only became oxygenated partway through the Cambrian period. That increase in the area of oxygen-rich waters coincided with an increase in large fossils appearing in the record and in animal diversity in general. However, it's interesting to note that the deeper parts of the ocean in these basins actually remained anoxic throughout this whole interval, and also note the history of oxygen during this time period is also one with with a lot of fluctuations rather than just a smooth and steady increase. Well, perhaps other changes in ocean chemistry played a role too. So, for example, the amount of calcium in seawater increased significantly during the Cambrian period, and marine animals with shells, such as clams or corals or trilobites or things that are common in the fossil record, make their shells from calcium minerals. Before the Cambrian period, very few organisms had shells. Here's a couple examples of ediacaran organisms with shells, but the Cambrian explosion was a huge increase in the number of shelly animals. But it wasn't just a diversification of animals with shells. It wasn't just that shells are preserving animals that weren't there before. The trace fossil record of burrows and trackways and the record of soft-bodied fossils themselves, like worms and so forth, both indicate that animals without shells also diversified a lot during this time period. All right, well, let's consider if biological factors might have contributed to this event. One possibility that's often talked about are these things called Hox genes. Now, genes in general are just the things that carry information for how to make an organism's body or parts of the body. And Hox genes are a special type that control large-scale features and that control how many other genes work. So, for example, Hox genes will determine, which part of the body becomes the head, for example. And they then turn on or off other genes to, say, make an eye in the correct place, or to make a wing in the correct place, and so forth. So because Hox genes control these large-scale features, they're really important in setting and evolving different body plans, in changing how many legs something has, or whether it has wings or not. These are all sort of large-scale body pattern things that Hox genes can affect. So Hox genes are present in most animals. They likely evolved in bilateria. Perhaps some early Hox genes evolved in eumetazoa, meaning they're found in everything except for sponges. But if that's the case, if Hox genes are present in all bilaterians, that means that they must have first evolved tens or perhaps even 100 or 150 million years before the Cambrian period began. So the Cambrian period was also a more complicated time to live compared to the Proterozoic, but perhaps less complicated to our current times. So the development of vertical burrowing, in one example, meant that animals started mixing the sediment. And by mixing sediment and water together, that made the seafloor softer. Well, for animals that want to sit on the seafloor and that can't move, this was bad news. These softer conditions would have been more challenging. If they didn't evolve strategies to deal with this, they would just sink into the soft sediment. So this was something they had to deal with. The Cambrian was also a time of increased predation. So predators would have evolved a variety of strategies for catching prey, and potential prey might evolve a variety of strategies for avoiding predators, detecting predators, protecting themselves from predators, and so forth. And finally, many more Cambrian animals were able to move around compared to ediacaran organisms. And so this would mean a whole variety of different strategies for moving, whether it's swimming or walking or crawling, and so forth. So how are all these things relevant? Well, increased ecological complexity in all of these different ways could have prompted the evolution of more diverse body plans. How might you ask? Well, for example, in the ediacaran, organisms only needed to do a few different things. They didn't have to deal with all this complex stuff going on, and so that could lead to only a few sort of well-adapted body plans. And this could be thought of just in a conceptual way as something called a fitness landscape. So for an individual organism, evolutionary fitness just refers to the likelihood of surviving and reproducing, and therefore passing genetic material on to the next generation. And so a fitness landscape is kind of a thought experiment, that describes the fitness for different types of bodies, different forms. And so in this graph here, the thing called morphogenetic rule is basically some just hypothetical aspect of the organism's, the animal's appearance. And so when the world is simple, there's only a few things you have to worry about doing, and so therefore there's perhaps only a few good ways of doing that. Only a few well-adapted body plans will end up becoming successful. But in the Cambrian, organisms needed to deal with a more complicated situation. But some of those needs were contradictory. For example, you might imagine that evolving a large and or strong shell would be beneficial for protection against predators. But using energy on a shell to make it could take away from energy from things like reproduction. So that's a trade-off. So there's always trade-offs in these things, and there's no longer like one best way to do things, right? So this complexity means that there's no longer just a couple good ways of addressing the needs, but the animals have many, many more possible ways of addressing these requirements. They might be really specialized in one area with trade-offs in another, and so forth. And so in our conceptual fitness landscape, this corresponds to a larger number of these peaks, these sort of well-adapted morphologies given sort of the conditions that are around. So therefore, evolution could potentially lead to a greater variety of body plans. Okay, well let's sort of wrap up then. We looked at these four possible factors that might have played some role in the Cambrian explosion: increased oxygen, increased calcium concentrations, genetic innovations from Hox genes, and increased ecological complexity that might have favored a greater diversity of solutions to that complexity. Now, of course, it's possible that multiple factors contributed, but I'll also encourage you to take what you've learned in this video to kind of try and categorize each of these factors. Maybe you think that some of them had limited importance overall. Maybe some were necessary preconditions, and that they occurred earlier and ended up setting the stage, but weren't the thing that started it going. But, so the question then is, well, what was the trigger, or what were the triggers, potentially if there were more than one, that kind of really got the Cambrian explosion going? Maybe some of these factors acted mostly as what we could potentially call like an amplifier. They helped increase diversification even more once it was going, but they didn't start it going in the first place. So what do you think? Which category would you put these factors in? Where do you think you might best categorize them? All right, thanks for listening.